Hello, I'm Jeanine Nodder, and this week on Chattin' with Jeanine, I brought in the former chief medical examiner for the state of New Hampshire. Before I introduce him, I have a story to share. As my regular viewers know, I grew up in the state of California. Before I hit double digits, there was a show on TV I used to watch all the time called Quincy. He was the medical examiner in forensic medicine, and then in 7th grade, we had a field trip to UCLA, and we talked to a medical examiner there, and I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to do autopsies and all that. But then I got to high school, and they made me dissect a frog. Ugh. And if that wasn't bad enough, my sophomore year, they expected me to dissect a fetal pig. I couldn't. I ran out crying. I said, I can't touch it. It looks like a baby. I can't do it. So, no, I didn't go to medical school, and I don't like gross things. So, and my guest is Tom Andrew. Thank you for putting up with my little story.
No problem, Jeanine, and it's a familiar one. The frog to pig progression is one that many high schoolers have to face.
Well, fortunately, I had a good teacher. He used to drive me to school, so he totally got it. He understood me, knows I was a good student. He said, all right, I'm not going to make you take the practical, and I'll give you a C, which was really, because I didn't get C's. I was a good student, but I just couldn't do it.
Well, you negotiated the best outcome.
Right. And I remember talking with the medical examiner at UCLA, and he said they were so used to doing autopsies, they could eat a sandwich and do an autopsy.
Yeah.
And then the X-Files. I don't know if you watched
Right.
the X-Files. Dana Scully
that.
could also, look at the contents of a stomach and then order pizza.
Right.
Like, oh.
It's just a matter of acclimation. You certainly get used to things that the general public may find a little distasteful.
Mm-hmm. So tell me your story. How did you get into this whole field?
Well, my pathway wasn't exactly laser focused. It was kind of circuitous, but I started out in high school wanting to be a veterinarian, but ended up applying to medical school instead and developed an interest in pediatrics. After medical school, I did a residency in pediatrics at Cincinnati Children's Medical Center, a very, very busy, large tertiary care center, and enjoyed it very much. I stayed on an extra year to be a chief resident of pediatrics there with 2 others. But then when I was out in private practice, I was with a 6-person general pediatrics group in suburban Cincinnati. I realized that the cases that engaged my imagination the most were the ones that interfaced with forensic medicine. Things like child abuse and neglect, sudden unexpected infant death, consumer product safety kinds of things, pool safety, car safety, those sorts of things.
So you've had to do autopsies on babies?
Oh, yes,
Oh.
yes. And so knowing that I had that interest and remembering a series of lectures in forensic pathology that I had as a medical student, I contacted that professor who by then had relocated to New York. He was chief medical examiner out in Hauppauge County in Long Island. Thankfully, he remembered me, he encouraged me, and I went into a residency in anatomical pathology in Cincinnati, but then relocated to New York in 1991 to join Dr. Hirsch, who was my mentor there. He had subsequently gone from Long Island to being chief medical examiner for the city of New York. So he brought me onto that staff. I stayed in New York from 91 to 97. And having started a family, we were not interested in staying in the city. So, and this opportunity came up. Roger Fossum, who was the very first medical examiner here in New Hampshire, died suddenly and unexpectedly in 1994, I believe it was. And they were searching for a new medical examiner, and I was fortunate enough to be interviewed and then approved by governor and council for my first of 4 5-year appointments in 1997.
Who was the governor then?
They were transitioning from Governor Jeanine to Governor Benson, I believe.
So I was going to say, I thought it was Benson. I couldn't remember the timeline.
I was actually appointed under Jeanine, but it was just prior to the election.
Ah, okay.
So I served under Jeanine through, it would be, I don't think Sununu had taken over prior to my leaving in 17, but I served under several governors.
Yes. So do you remember your first autopsy?
My first autopsy was as a resident in pathology in Cincinnati, Ohio. She was a 64-year-old woman who died of cancer. This was not a forensic autopsy. This was a hospital autopsy. I was being trained, but you never forget that first encounter.
That's why I asked.
I'm, forever thankful to her. I can still see her face. I can still see her exam. But that starts that cycle of sort of getting used to separating yourself from the humanity of the situation and trying to focus on the clinical aspects of things so that you can provide the answers that those that are left behind really need to know.
My oldest sister, well, she's retired now, is a nurse, and they, in her schooling, there was a body, and the hand was showing out of the sheet, and the lady had fingernail polish on, and that brought the humanity, and she said that was hard. That
is difficult. Any sort of reminder of that can sort of distract you from the task at hand. And I don't mean you need to be cold and callous. The day you stop caring about people is probably the day you need to walk away from that work because you're not going to be effective. That has to be a part of it, but you have to separate enough to really focus on the clinical and what your task is in terms of determining the cause and the manner of that person's death.
So what are some of the most memorable situations that you've encountered?
Cases are memorable for many different things. Maybe the circumstances of the death, maybe it was a high profile sort of thing, maybe it was somebody you knew. This is a small jurisdiction.
Wow, have you had to do autopsies on people you know?
On occasion, and in a small jurisdiction, and by jurisdiction I mean the state of New Hampshire. The medical examiner's office is a statewide office, and we serve the 1.5 million people that are in the state, but 70% of our population lives Lakes Region and south. And you get to meet a lot of people in a public position, as I'm sure you have encountered.
Right, I'm the state representative.
So it happens. And if it's too close to the bone, it's probably wise to recuse yourself and ask your colleague to do the case. But there were times when I felt I was up to it and I went ahead and did it. It's a service. It's an act of love that you can give to a person and their family in particular. So if you're not too close to it and you're up to it, it's probably a good thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so take us through the process of what is an autopsy, what happens first? Yeah.
Well, a forensic autopsy has different goals and objectives than a hospital autopsy. But let's focus on the forensic work. The question in these individuals is the cause and the manner of their death. Now, the cause of death is the disease or injury that killed them. Sometimes that's obvious, sometimes it's not. But that is the task of the autopsy examination, is figuring what that cause is. Then as an ancillary feature of that, and this is unique to medical examiners, the hospital pathologist doesn't have to do this. After the autopsy and you have a cause, then you need to certify the manner of that person's death. While there are many, many causes, there are only 5 manners, and that's natural, accident, suicide, homicide, and in a small percentage of cases, 2 to 5%, it's undetermined, even after a complete investigation, including an autopsy.
Wow, have you encountered very many of those?
Yes. Let's say the example of a skeletonized body found in the White Mountains. Well, there may not be a lot of tissue to work with. There may not be any internal organs to examine. You may not have specimens that are adequate for toxicology. So, did this person, presumably you have identified them at some point, could they have died of natural causes while hiking? Could they have had an accident? Could they have come under some sort of foul play? The autopsy in those circumstances is silent on that. So we end up having to say that the cause is undetermined and the manner is undetermined. So it's very few cases, but that does come up from time to time.
Mm-hmm. Do you cover your face when you do an autopsy?
An autopsy is conducted not in a sterile operating room environment, but in an environment wherein we use personal protective equipment. Face mask, face guard, goggles if you don't wear glasses, gown, triple gowns really. You have a cloth gown, a disposable gown over that, and then you use a plastic apron on top of that. 2 layers of gloves, and in between those 2 layers you have a cut-resistant layer of gloves. The last thing you want to do is cut yourself when doing that. So yes, we use personal protective equipment when doing those examinations.
Now, are all autopsies done the same? Like all the bodies are all opened in the same manner?
In general, the protocol is the same for the vast majority of cases. And there's a good reason for that. If you have a systematic A to Z approach with every single case that you encounter, you're less likely to forget something that's important. If you get distracted by, oh, I think this is what killed them, and you just go right at that, you forget to take the necessary steps. It's just like flying a plane. They go through that same checklist every single time. So yes, the process is basically the same. There is there are actually 3 external examinations. The body comes in just as it was at the scene of death, and that is examined, imaged, sketched. And then the body's disrobed. We look at all the surfaces of the body, looking for any evidence of disease or injury. And again, it's documented with your notes, your sketches, and your photographs. Then a 3rd external examination takes place, wherein you focus on those abnormalities of the skin. Let's say it's a gunshot wound or a stab wound. And they're measured, they're photographed close up. Any trace evidence that may be available is collected from there, hairs, fibers, that sort of thing. It's only after that 3rd external examination that a scalpel is used to open the body. We typically use a Y-shaped incision, starting at the shoulders, going to the middle part of the chest, and then down the center of the body. That allows the pathologist to examine each of the internal organs in a systematic fashion, again, looking for disease or injury. During that internal examination, various tissue samples may be taken to look at under the microscope. There are some conditions that are not evident to the naked eye, but under the microscope reveal the cause of death. For example, myocarditis.
What is that?
That's a viral infection of the heart muscle that can cause sudden, unexpected death. And externally, you have no findings whatsoever. You'll only see it if you look at heart muscle under the microscope. Those internal specimens may be used for other special testing as well. Drug testing, infectious disease testing, serologies of various types. So that whole process, in a very straightforward case, from external examination to completion of the autopsy, can take anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. But if it's a complex case, let's say it's a rape homicide with multiple stab wounds, well, that case is going to take hours to do, and to do properly, because you have to document all of the evidence that's attended to the case.
Oh, wow. Have you ever been spooked by an autopsy? Has there ever been a case that was just so horrible that it haunted you?
I don't think so.
No? I was thinking like a murder, like a horrible murder.
There are cases that I remember for various reasons, but none that I think I took home with me. I think that's an important tool for a medical examiner or a forensic pathologist to have in their toolbox, and that is that ability to leave it there. people cope in many different ways. I happen to be a person of faith, but and I also like cooking. So, if you have those sorts of outlets, family supports, that sort of thing, it makes it easier to disconnect from those sorts of things. But that said, the only time I ever had to walk away from the autopsy table didn't have anything to do with the autopsies. I was doing 2 autopsies on women. They were elderly women who were alleged to have been poisoned by morphine by a so-called angel of death at a nursing home.
Ooh.
And I was doing those cases on September the 11th, 2001. And I was in the middle of the first case when someone called from the office upstairs and they said, "You better turn on the radio." So we did. And I'm doing that first case while all of this horrible stuff is going on. We finished and we put the second case on the table. And I had just gotten started on her. And there was a description. I didn't have a television. It was a description on the radio of the North Tower coming down.
We all remember that day.
And I had to step out of the room and sort of recompose myself.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with the autopsy, but history was happening, and it was a horrible history.
Yes. Speaking of history, COVID, did you see more cases during the COVID time?
Well, COVID, in that its peak was in 20. I was already out of the office by that time.
Yes, right. That's right. You said
I had
2017.
retired in 17, and I can tell you, because I stay in touch with the folks that followed me, that it was in the initial stages quite a burden on the office. But then once people started getting a handle on the kinds of things that COVID could do to the body, we were less inclined to accept jurisdiction, or they were less inclined to accept jurisdiction and do these cases. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it is with a new public health sort of thing. It was the same thing during the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. Initially, a lot of those cases were autopsied because we just didn't know a whole lot about HIV. But then as we learned more, fewer and fewer of those cases were actually autopsied.
Right. Did any of the medical examiners get HIV from doing autopsies on?
I'm not aware of a single case of transmission via autopsy of HIV.
What about COVID?
Nor COVID. I am not aware of anyone who either converted or had a documented case. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, but it's just not in my experience. I didn't hear about that.
It seems like a lot of people were classified as dying of COVID, whether they did or not. Like I know somebody, it was very close to us, who he had a heart attack, but he had COVID, so they said he died of COVID.
I think that's a real problem in terms of our statistical analysis of the impact of this. And that's what happens, Jeanine, when a disease becomes politicized. Mm-hmm. HIV became politicized, and we saw COVID to a large extent become politicized. And those kinds of certification errors are the result of that, unfortunately. Did they die of COVID or did they die with COVID? And sometimes in the zeal to generate data, we lose sight of that. And hopefully medical examiners or forensic pathologists are not prone to those kinds of decisions.
Do you happen to know what most people in New Hampshire die of?
The leading
cause of death in New Hampshire.
Yeah, when you talk about the medical examiner's office, there's this misconception that's all homicide all the time. Well, fortunately, it's not. We live in a very peaceful state, right? 60% of the cases that the medical examiner's office handles are natural deaths. We only have anywhere from 15 to 20, 22 homicides a year. The number one cause of death in New Hampshire, by far, is some sort of variation on cholesterol-related or hypertension-related heart disease. Heart disease takes most of the lives. There's going to be 12,000, 13,000 of Granite Staters that are going to die every year. That's just the nature of the beast. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the statistics, hypertensive and arteriosclerotic heart disease are going to be the leading causes. And now there are plenty of others that are very, very close behind them, things like COPD and cancers of various types, all kinds of natural diseases. But it's the heart and the brain.
Thank you. Does every person that dies get an autopsy?
No. Of those 13,000 people who die each year in the state, only about 5,000 to 6,000 come to the attention of the medical examiner's office because there is a statute. It's RSA 611A, I believe it is. And that defines 25 separate categories of death that need to be reported to the medical examiner for investigation. Now, reporting the death doesn't automatically mean it's going to be autopsied. You can get a report of a death that falls under our jurisdiction, and all of the information is there that would allow you to certify the cause and the manner of that person's death without having to do an autopsy. But in about 500 cases a year, now pushing 600 cases a year, those folks end up being autopsied for various reasons. Every homicide, for example, must be autopsied. You're not going to go to court without an autopsy on a homicide victim. But most deaths of children that are sudden, unexpected, or violent are going to be autopsied. All sudden, unexpected infant deaths are going to be autopsied. Traffic deaths may or may not, depending on whether or not somebody is being held liable for that person's death. If there are pending charges of vehicular homicide or whatever, you want to have all the information you can get, and that would include an autopsy on those who died in the crash.
Have you had to testify in court in your time?
Oh, I've testified in court
many times?
Dozens and dozens of times, as recently as last week. Since I retired, I maintained a consulting practice. I have a private consulting practice in forensic pathology called White Mountain Forensic Consulting Services. And I provide forensic medical consultation for various entities. And last week I testified, or I was involved in trials in Brooklyn and in Toms River, New Jersey. Mm-hmm. And I still have occasional cases here in New Hampshire that I testify in.
You may have already answered this question, but because when you were talking about you have that standard set of the procedures you go through, the steps, have you often been surprised, like you thought the person died of one thing, but they actually died of something else?
Yes, and I think that's the best argument to do your autopsy examination in that systematic fashion. It prevents tunnel vision. If you go in thinking this is going to be the cause of death, you can deceive yourself and, well, okay, I think I've got enough here. But if you go in with an open mind, then sometimes you get surprised. Well, that's part of the joy of doing that work, right? It's like, I don't know everything, and you've taught me something today, thank you. And you give the family the most accurate information that there, rather than just mailing it in. You know, you need to attend to what you're doing, and you need to be willing to be surprised. You can't go in with a set, biased opinion as to what you're going to find.
So we had talked about forensic and hospital. What is the difference?
The goals and objectives in a hospital autopsy differ somewhat. The cause of death is probably pretty well known, but in a hospital setting, they may want to know about the effect of the chosen therapy. You know, why didn't this therapy work on this patient? Or if they were if they had a complex disease, what is it that intervened on this particular day that caused their death? Did they have a blood clot that went to their lung that we couldn't have prevented? Or did they have some sort of progression of their natural disease and we missed it? The hospital autopsy is a vanishing breed. As recently as the 1960s, upwards to 30 to 40% of hospital deaths got autopsied in the hospital. That percentage is less than 5, and in some places less than 3. New hospital construction now doesn't even include an autopsy space.
Oh, interesting.
There are many, many reasons for that. There is this blind faith in imaging studies and diagnostics that can be done, and physicians are under the impression that they know all their they know all there needs to be known about why that person died, but many studies have shown that that's not true. The other thing, quite frankly, I think is fear of litigation, but studies have also shown that autopsy examinations of the deceased in hospital settings actually prevent more suits than they bring about.
Now, if somebody's watching this show and they're interested and they want to become a medical examiner, what do they do? What are their options?
Well,
when
first
they
of
go to
all,
school?
we welcome you, we praise you, because we are hopelessly understaffed. At any given time, there are only about 500 forensic pathologists practicing this specialty in all of the United States. We need quadruple that figure. So, get yourself graduated from high school, attend a 4-year college, accredited college, get a baccalaureate degree in whatever you want. But after that, you'll need to go to medical school for 4 years. Subsequent to medical school, you pursue you pursue a residency in anatomic and forensic pathology. That's another 5 years.
Say that again.
A residency in anatomic and clinical pathology.
Okay.
And that takes 5 years. And then after that, you would pursue subspecialty training in forensic pathology for 1 to 2 years, depending on how you are.
So it's pretty intense schooling.
It is
Yeah.
intense schooling, but if that is what you're hardwired to do, it flies by, and then you're going to enjoy 30 to 35 years of the wildest, most fun ride of your life.
Well, it's been more than 35 years since I was in 7th grade and went to UCLA and was all, yeah, I want to do this, and I'm not going to make it now. I don't want
Well,
to.
I certainly don't regret it, and I certainly don't regret my little detour into pediatrics. It carved out a specialty area for me within forensic pathology. I'm kind of a go-to person for infant and child death and infant and child pathology, and it's made for a very interesting career.
Well, this was a very interesting show, and thank you so much for coming to Merrimack and telling me all about your job.
Well, I appreciate you having me.
So
Thanks
thank
a
you.
bunch.
It's nice meeting you, too.
Take care.
Thank you. And thank you for watching.